It would be impossible not to mention film grain among other effects of our cinematic post-processing chain. The visible silver crystals in the film negative's emulsion adds something very important to the filmic vibe, so let's try to recreate it. A quick note, we'll use a fairly simplistic method for adding grain, only suitable for static renders, even though there are ways to make animated noise in Blender Compositor. Alright, we would need the image node with the film grain texture loaded in. You can find one in the project files. If you hold Ctrl-Shift and click on this node, you will notice that I cheated a little bit and this texture resembles a digital noise rather than a film grain, but it will work just as well for our purposes. So let's connect it to the second socket of the newly created mix node, set the blending mode to overlay. It led to some rather weird darkening of the image, and that's because this texture was designed to be used with the linear color space. So that is important to keep in mind, the color spaces of any texture, whether it should be sRGB or linear. And then basically what we need to do is mix in a teensy bit of that noise, a homeopathic dose really. It could be pretty hard to see. I hope you're able to notice it through the video compression. Let me zoom it in for you. Our digital noise texture imposed over the image helps to break up a perfect digital look, the straightness of lines. It kind of brings all elements together by throwing in a layer of entropy on top of it and diluting the digital look, just like we have said. So that is our film grain, even though it's not necessarily filmic in this particular case. It is also worth mentioning that the size of the noise can be changed with the help of this scale node. And I also wanted to mention that we have included some real film grain textures in the project files, like the real deal, so have a look. That being said, a tiny amount of a good old random noise or purling noise gets the job done in this case. And that is usually one of the finishing touches that I add to the post-processing pipeline that helps to soften the digital look, even though it's a digital noise. That's paradoxical. Next we'll have a look at the output blanking, aka changing the aspect ratio visually, and then we recap the steps that we have taken. In the realm of cinematic post-processing, changing the aspect ratio to something widescreen is an easy win. I know it could sound weird, but adding the black bars to the top and bottom of the image, or so-called letterboxing the image, could make it look slightly more cinematic right out of the box. Or let's put it like this, it could be a useful way to explore different possibilities related to changing the aspect ratio. So let's set up a box mask, set the width to 1 and the height to something that represents our letterbox. A quick disclaimer, it won't be terribly useful in the case of this image because it was already widescreen right off the start, but other than that it could be very handy to know. So the box mask goes into the invert node, and that goes into the mix factor of our aspect ratio mix node. Then the height parameter in the box mask could be used to calibrate the output blanking. To avoid any confusion, the output blanking is meant for, well, for preview. The aspect ratio of the final render should be defined in the output tab via adjusting the resolution. And of course, we should also mention that there is no direct link between some aspect ratio and how cinematic it looks in the end. So when I say that the widescreen aspect ratio is somehow cinematic, I'm obviously being ironic, even though it's true to some extent. There are some historical connotations of certain aspect ratios like anamorphic format or 4:3 that was adopted more than 100 years ago originally. But anyway, I think it is still very useful to be able to control the aspect ratio like that in the Blender Compositor, so here we go.